Beneath the Ice. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Dr. Richard Caldwell stood at the edge of the excavation site, the harsh Arctic wind biting at his face as he gazed at the icy expanse before him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie twilight over the landscape, despite it being midday. They were deep in the Arctic Circle, miles away from the nearest human settlement, searching for something that was never meant to be found. 2 months ago, a strange signal had been detected beneath the ice, a signal that defied all known science. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but persistent. Richard and his team of geologists, scientists, and engineers were sent by the government under the guise of routine geological research. But he knew better. This was no ordinary mission. The crew had been working tirelessly for weeks, drilling deeper and deeper into the ancient ice. The layers they uncovered told stories of a time long before humans walked the earth, of cataclysmic events and the rise and fall of unknown civilizations. Yet, nothing could have prepared them for what they found next. "Dr. Caldwell, you need to see this." The urgent voice of Emma, the lead engineer, crackled through the radio. Richard hurried over, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground as he approached the site. Emma was standing near the drilling rig, her face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. "What is it?" Richard asked, his breath visible in the frigid air. She handed him a tablet displaying the latest scan results. "We've hit something metallic. And it's massive." Richard's heart raced as he studied the screen. The object was buried nearly 3 miles beneath the ice, far too deep for any known human artifact. It was a perfect circle about 100 feet in diameter, and the material, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. The readings suggested it wasn't made of any metal found on Earth. This can't be right," Richard murmured, trying to make sense of the data. But there it was, clear as day, a colossal, unidentified object buried in the ancient ice. "We need to dig it out," Emma said, her voice tinged with excitement. "This could be the discovery of the century." Richard nodded, but a feeling of unease gnawed at him. Something about this didn't feel right. He had a nagging suspicion that whatever they had found was never meant to be uncovered. But there was no turning back now. The truth was calling from beneath the ice, and Richard knew they had to answer. As the drilling continued, Richard couldn't shake the ominous feeling that something terrible was about to be unleashed. The ice had kept this secret for millennia, and he feared what would happen once it was exposed to the world. Chapter 2. The Warning. The drilling rig roared to life once again, its powerful engines echoing through the frozen wasteland. As the drill bit tore through the final layers of ice, Richard felt the tension among the crew. Everyone was on edge, their curiosity tinged with a growing sense of dread. It was as if the very air around them had become heavier, more oppressive, with each passing hour. Emma monitored the progress closely, her eyes fixed on the screens displaying real-time data from the drill. "We're almost there," she muttered, half to herself and half to Richard, who stood by her side, arms crossed, staring at the darkening horizon. The sun had dipped even lower, casting long shadows across the ice. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the wind had picked up, howling through the camp with an eerie, mournful wail. Richard's unease grew with each gust of wind, as if the Arctic itself was warning them to stop. "Dr. Caldwell." A voice crackled over the radio, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Liam, one of the geologists stationed near the drilling site. "You might want to come over here. There's something strange happening." Richard exchanged a worried glance with Emma before heading towards Liam's position. As they approached, they could see a small crowd had gathered around the site. Liam stood at the edge, his face pale as he pointed towards the drill. "What is it?" Richard asked, but as he looked closer, he saw it for himself. The ice around the drilling site had started to crack, forming a network of deep fissures that radiated outward like the web of a spider. "Is the ground unstable?" Emma asked, her voice laced with concern. Liam shook his head. "It's not the ground. The ice, it's reacting to something down there. It's almost like it's alive." Richard felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We need to stop the drilling," he said urgently, but before he could reach for the radio, a loud crack echoed through the air. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a low, rumbling noise emanated from deep within the ice. The crew stumbled back, fear evident on their faces as the fissures widened, forming a massive chasm right at the center of the drilling site. "Get back!" Richard shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. The crew scrambled to retreat as the ground beneath the drill began to collapse, sending the heavy machinery plunging into the abyss below. A deafening silence followed, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. The crew gathered at a safe distance, staring in stunned silence at the gaping hole where the drill had been moments before. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he peered into the darkness below. And then, from the depths of the chasm, a faint, pulsating glow emerged. It was an unnatural light, cold and blue, casting an eerie luminescence on the surrounding ice. Richard's breath caught in his throat as the light grew brighter, filling the chasm with an otherworldly radiance. "We've awakened something," Liam whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "We should have never come here." Richard didn't respond. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the glowing chasm, his mind racing with possibilities. What had they uncovered? And more importantly, what had they unleashed? "Seal the site," Richard ordered, his voice firm despite the terror gripping him. "We need to contain this, whatever it is. No one else can know about this." But even as he spoke, he knew it was already too late. The secret had been buried for a reason, and now that it was uncovered, there was no going back. The Arctic had kept its secret hidden beneath the ice for thousands of years, but now, as the cold light pulsed from the chasm, Richard feared that the world was about to change in ways they could never have imagined. Chapter 3. The Intruder. The camp was in a state of lockdown. Richard had ordered the team to seal off the area around the chasm, constructing makeshift barriers from whatever they could find. No one was to enter or leave without his express permission. The glow from the chasm continued to pulse, casting eerie shadows across the ice as the night closed in. The temperature dropped further, yet the light showed no sign of dimming. Richard sat in his tent, poring over the data they had gathered before the drill had plunged into the abyss. The object beneath the ice, whatever it was like nothing they had ever encountered. Its structure was impossibly dense, its composition unknown. The readings suggested it was emitting a low-frequency signal, almost like a heartbeat, but one too faint to be detected without specialized equipment. As he sifted through the information, his radio crackled to life. "Dr. Caldwell, you need to come to the perimeter," came Emma's urgent voice. Richard grabbed his coat and rushed out into the freezing night. The cold wind bit at his face as he made his way towards the perimeter where Emma and a few other team members were gathered, their faces pale with tension. "What's going on?" Richard demanded. Emma pointed to a figure approaching the camp from the direction of the chasm. "We've got an intruder." Richard squinted into the darkness. Sure enough, a lone figure was making its way towards them, stumbling through the snow. The glow from the chasm cast the stranger's silhouette in a ghostly light, making them look almost otherworldly. How did they get here? Richard wondered aloud. The camp was miles away from any civilization, and the weather was treacherous. No one should have been able to reach them, especially not at night. As the figure drew closer, Richard's unease deepened. The intruder was wearing a heavy parka, the hood pulled low over their face. Their movements were sluggish, almost mechanical, as if they were being driven by something beyond their control. "Stop!" Richard called out, raising a hand to signal the intruder to halt. "Who are you?" The figure paused, swaying slightly in the wind. Then, without warning, they collapsed into the snow. Emma and Liam rushed forward, dragging the stranger to their feet and pulling back the hood to reveal the face of a young woman, her skin deathly pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Get her inside quickly," Richard ordered. They half-carried, half-dragged the woman into one of the heated tents, where they laid her down on a cot. Her clothes were soaked through, her body shivering uncontrollably. "Who are you?" Richard asked again, more gently this time. "How did you get here?" The woman's lips trembled as she tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. You have to stop. You have to leave this place. It's not safe." Richard exchanged a worried glance with Emma. "What do you mean? What's not safe?" The woman's eyes darted around the tent as if she expected something to burst through the walls at any moment. The light, it calls to them. They're coming. They'll kill us all. Who's coming? Richard pressed, but the woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand, she sobbed. It's too late. They're already here. Before Richard could ask anything more, the woman's eyes rolled back and she fell unconscious. Emma checked her pulse, nodding to confirm that she was still alive, though barely. What do you think she meant? Liam asked, his voice tinged with fear. Richard didn't answer right away. He had no idea who this woman was or how she had managed to survive in the brutal Arctic conditions. But her words had chilled him to the bone. The light, it calls to them. We need to find out more about what we're dealing with, Richard said finally. There's something out there, something that's been buried for thousands of years. And if what she says is true, it's waking up. The team exchanged uneasy glances. The pulse from the chasm seemed to grow stronger, the glow brighter, as if it were responding to their fears. Richard knew they were running out of time. Whatever lay beneath the ice, they had to understand it, before it understood them. Chapter 4. The Assault. The woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored as Emma tended to her. Richard paced the length of the tent, trying to piece together the fragments of information they had. The team's fear was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something catastrophic. Dr. Caldwell, Emma called softly from the woman's bedside. She's burning up. I think she's running a fever, but there's something strange about it. It's almost as if her body is reacting to the cold, not the heat. Richard frowned, kneeling beside the cot to get a closer look. The woman's skin was flushed, and her forehead was slick with sweat despite the freezing temperatures. Is she hypothermic? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma shook her head. No, it's something else. Her body is fighting something, but I don't know what. Richard's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Could it be some kind of infection? A disease that had been frozen in the ice for millennia, now released by their drilling? But that didn't explain her warning or the strange behavior of the ice. Before he could delve deeper into his thoughts, a loud crash echoed from outside the tent, followed by the sound of frantic shouting. Richard and Emma exchanged a startled glance before rushing out into the frigid night. The camp was in chaos. The barriers they had erected around the chasm were being torn down, not by the wind or the elements, but by something unseen. The ice beneath the camp was splintering, massive cracks radiating outwards from the chasm as if the ground itself was being ripped apart. Get back! Richard shouted, but the team members were already scrambling for cover as the ice groaned and shifted beneath their feet. What the hell is happening? Liam yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of cracking ice and roaring wind. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area. The glow from the chasm had intensified, pulsating like a beacon in the darkness. And then, through the snow and ice, he saw them. Figures moving in the shadows, barely visible against the backdrop of white. At first, Richard thought it was a trick of the light, his eyes playing tricks on him in the midst of the chaos. But as the figures drew closer, he realized with mounting horror that they were very real. Humanoid shapes, tall and thin, their bodies seemingly made of the same glowing light that pulsed from the chasm. They're here, someone screamed, and the camp erupted into panic. The glowing figures moved with impossible speed, darting between the tents and machinery, their forms flickering in and out of visibility like phantoms. Fall back, Richard ordered, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her away from the camp. We need to get to the vehicles. But the figures were everywhere, their glowing forms surrounding the camp in a tightening circle. Richard's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, but there was no time. One of the figures lunged at them, its arm, if it could be called that, extending like a blade of light. Richard barely had time to react. He shoved Emma to the ground, throwing himself in front of her as the blade of light sliced through the air. Pain exploded in his side as the blade grazed him, but he forced himself to stay on his feet. We need to get out of here, Emma shouted, her voice trembling with fear. Richard nodded, his vision swimming as he struggled to remain conscious. The glowing figures were closing in, their movements synchronized as if they were a single entity. There was no time to question what they were or how they had come to be. Survival was all that mattered now. Go! he shouted, pushing Emma towards the vehicles. "I'll hold them off." But Emma hesitated, her eyes wide with fear and concern. "You're hurt." "I'll be fine," Richard insisted, though he knew he was lying. The pain in his side was worsening, and he could feel the warmth of his blood seeping through his coat. "Just go." Reluctantly, Emma turned and ran towards the vehicles, calling for the others to follow. Richard watched as the team scrambled into the snowcats, the engines roaring to life. But as he turned to face the approaching figures, he knew there was no escaping this. The glowing beings surrounded him, their forms pulsating with light as they closed in. Richard raised his hands in a futile attempt to defend himself, but the nearest figure reached out, its light enveloping him. In that moment, Richard's mind was flooded with images, flashes of a world long forgotten, of beings who had once ruled the earth, now buried beneath the ice. The light wasn't just a signal, it was a call, a summons from something ancient and powerful. And now it was awake. As the light consumed him, Richard understood the woman's warning all too well. They were never meant to find this place. The ice had kept it secret for a reason, and now they would all pay the price. Chapter 5. The Return. Richard awoke with a jolt, gasping for air as if he had been drowning. His body was numb, the pain in his side a dull throb as he slowly regained consciousness. He was lying on his back, staring up at a sky that seemed impossibly far away, the stars above him twinkling through a haze of swirling snow. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was or what had happened. But then, like a rush of cold water, it all came flooding back. The chasm, the glowing figures, the assault. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey, his muscles sluggish and unresponsive. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't move. His limbs felt like lead, weighed down by an invisible force. He was trapped, helpless in the freezing cold, with no idea how much time had passed. The camp was eerily silent, the only sound the distant howling of the wind. "Emma?" he croaked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But there was no response, no sign of life anywhere around him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he struggled to stay conscious, the cold seeping into his bones. And then, through the swirling snow, he saw movement, figures approaching from the direction of the chasm. At first, he thought the glowing beings had returned, but as they drew closer, he realized these were human shapes, bundled in heavy coats and moving with purpose. "Richard," a voice called out, and he recognized it instantly. "Emma." She was the first to reach him, dropping to her knees beside him and cradling his head in her hands. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear and relief as she looked him over. "You're alive," she breathed, her voice trembling. "We thought we lost you." Richard tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Emma's expression turned to one of concern as she noticed the blood staining his coat, and she quickly waved over the others. "We need to get him out of here," she said urgently. "He's hurt." Liam and another team member lifted Richard onto a makeshift stretcher, carrying him towards one of the snowcats. As they moved, Richard's vision blurred, the pain in his side growing more intense with each step. He fought to stay awake, but the cold and exhaustion were overwhelming. "Emma?" he whispered again, his voice barely audible. "I'm here," she said softly, leaning close to him as they placed him in the snowcat. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." But Richard wasn't so sure. The memory of the glowing figures and the flood of images they had shown him lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that something far beyond their understanding had been unleashed. The snowcat rumbled to life, and Richard felt the vibration of the engine beneath him as they began to move. The team was silent, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. No one spoke as they sped away from the camp, the chasm, and whatever horrors lay beneath it. Richard's thoughts drifted in and out of focus as the snowcat sped across the frozen wasteland. He knew they were headed for the nearest outpost, a small research station several miles away, where they could radio for help. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still in danger, that something was following them. As they approached the outpost, Richard's vision began to fade, darkness creeping in at the edges. He heard Emma calling his name, her voice filled with urgency, but he couldn't respond. The world around him dissolved into a blur, and he was plunged into unconsciousness once more. Chapter 6. The revelation. When Richard awoke again, he was warm, the soft hum of machinery in the background a comforting reminder that he was no longer out in the cold. He opened his eyes to find himself lying in a bed, a blanket pulled up to his chest, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the air. He was in a small, dimly lit room, hooked up to a series of monitors that beeped quietly beside him. His body ached all over, but the sharp pain in his side had dulled, replaced by a throbbing that suggested he had been treated for his injuries. "You're awake." Emma's voice came from the doorway, and Richard turned his head to see her standing there, a look of relief washing over her face. She stepped into the room, pulling up a chair beside his bed and sitting down. "Where?" Richard's voice was hoarse, his throat dry. "We're at the outpost," Emma explained, her tone gentle. "You've been out for a couple of days. The doctor patched you up, but you were in pretty bad shape." Richard tried to sit up, but Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him to stay still. "You need to rest," she said softly. "You've been through a lot." Richard closed his eyes, the memories of the past few days flooding back. "The others, the camp. They're all safe," Emma assured him. "We managed to get everyone out before anything else happened." Richard opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze. "But something did happen, didn't it?" Emma hesitated, her expression darkening. "After we got you to the outpost, we contacted the higher-ups. They've sent in a specialized team to secure the site, but they're not telling us much. Just that it's classified and we're not to speak of it to anyone." Richard felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the room. "They're going to cover it up." Emma nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. "Whatever we found out there, it's too dangerous. They don't want anyone to know." "But we can't just ignore it," Richard protested weakly. "There's something out there, something ancient. If we leave it alone, who knows what could happen." Emma looked at him sadly. "I know, Richard, but what choice do we have? We barely made it out alive. The others, they're all too scared to talk about it. And I don't blame them." Richard's mind raced as he considered the implications. The images the glowing figures had shown him were etched into his memory, a world long forgotten, a civilization buried beneath the ice, and a power that could reshape everything they knew. And now it was awake. He couldn't just let it go, but he also knew that going back would be suicide. The secret they had uncovered was too big, too dangerous, and there were forces far more powerful than them determined to keep it hidden. Maybe it's better this way," Richard said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe it's better if the world never knows." Emma reached out, taking his hand in hers. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "But for now you need to rest. We're safe here. That's all that matters." Richard nodded, though his thoughts were far from settled. As he lay back against the pillows, he couldn't shake the feeling that their discovery was only the beginning. The light beneath the ice, the ancient beings, they weren't done with them yet. And as the outpost's lights flickered in the darkness, Richard knew that the world was on the brink of something unimaginable. The ice had kept its secrets for thousands of years, but now that they were uncovered, there was no going back. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, give a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below.